Okay, great. Well, I'm going to get started. So again, welcome everybody. Use the Q&A functionality as you go through. Chris will answer what he can, and then if there's anything else, I will do that in the Q&A session at the end. So off we go. So some of you may have attended the IELTS webinar that I presented a couple of weeks ago in late September that gave an overview of the exam. Today, I'm just going to concentrate on the listening section. And at the moment, I have created, when I teach an IELTS student, I do it in, I try to do the listening section within 8 or 9 lessons. And obviously, starting with an introductory lesson, I believe it's always important with the introduction to show the students the structure of the test. One thing that you will know having IELTS students. Okay, so sorry, I will try and speak more slowly. One thing that with the IELTS students is that they will often have already sat the test, or they are students obviously with a lot of previous experience in English as a second language classes. So you're not really focusing on the grammar or vocabulary at this point. When you get an IELTS student, the idea is that you want to teach them a couple of things. One is the structure of the test, and the second one are the question types that they will encounter. These are the biggest challenges for students, particularly the question types. So when I start with the introduction, really the one thing that I would focus on with a new candidate is in the listening section, you will only hear each recording once. You will never hear it again. And this is really important because when you are in a lesson environment with a student, obviously we repeat things, we allow students a second or third occasion to be able to get the answer right, but in the exam, never more than once. So keep that in mind when you are actually doing activities based on listening for an IELTS candidate, because you might like to do what I do, and I tend to not always let the student have a second, third, fourth go. If they don't get it right, that's really mirroring what will happen in the exam and simply move on. It encourages the student to keep going, to progress and to improve. But obviously you don't want that to be a demotivating force for the student as well. Another thing you might like to stress is that in the listening exam, the students will have 30 minutes and they are, unlike the reading section of IELTS, given an extra 10 minutes to transfer their answers from the exam paper to the answer sheet. This is the only section of the exam where this happens. So you might like to make them aware of that, because in the reading section, you are not given an extra opportunity to do this. Obviously, no dictionary, and the listening section is the first part of the IELTS exam that the candidate will do. They're usually the most confident in this section, and there are 4 parts. The 4 parts become gradually more difficult as part 4 obviously is the most difficult of the listening texts. Part 1 is the easiest. The other thing that is standard in the IELTS listening exam is that different questions, parts 1 and 2, for example, will be a conversation, and they're pretty standard. There will be some kind of timetable involved, or there will be somebody wanting to join a group or a tour. And then the second one is a monologue. And this can take place as I've heard them being answering machine messages, or someone giving some kind of presentation to a group of people before they proceed somewhere else. So again, both of these are really about the provision of information for some kind of transaction. In parts 3 and 4, they become more academic in nature. There's a higher level or higher proficiency vocabulary is required, but the topics are still there to be understood by a non-expert. When I sat the IELTS listening exam in part 4, I remember the monologue. It was a lecture on seabirds I know absolutely nothing about it, but as a native speaker, I was able to understand the paraphrasing and the distractors and really focus. So this is when you're teaching listening for specific, listening for specific information, it really comes into its own for the student in parts 3 and particularly 4 of the paper. I'll also just mention that in parts 1, 2, and 3, the recording is played from the beginning to the end. That's it. In part 4, there is generally a pause. The 5.5 minutes or up to 7 minute recording would be paused in the middle. The students will have approximately 30 to 40 seconds in which to read the next series of questions before listening to the second part of the academic text. Okay, so I'll move through. One thing I do want to stress is that IELTS uses standard English accents from around the world. I particularly want to point this out to people in North America because I know that North American is the English that is learned and certainly in publications these days perhaps promoted them up. Well, not promoted is not the right word, but it's extensively used around the world in textbooks. And because of this, you must be very careful that your candidate has exposure to all of the accents that I have listed here on this slide. So you want them to have exposure to standard accents within the United States, Canada, across the British Isles, Australia, and New Zealand. If you're unfamiliar with these accents, at least give your student, you won't be unfamiliar as a native speaker or a near native speaker, you will understand the accents, but what you want to do is ensure that your student has a very sound grasp of these, and if they have not had sufficient exposure, get them onto the radio stations that the online radio stations that I will show you before. Let me go through here. Oh, sorry, I've just gone. Okay. The other thing I want to mention is because as human beings we have a strong emotional attachment to accents, one of the mistakes or one of the errors that I have seen teachers make with IELTS candidates is they put their own cultural values onto the accent that is spoken. We all have accents that are harsh to us to the ear, others that are pleasant sounding, others that may sound more educated than others. Be very careful that you do not push any of your own cultural values, because the IELTS is one of the best listening tests around today. It really tests how the candidate understands English as it is spoken in its standard forms across the planet. So no matter what your opinion, make sure that your student has full exposure to different accents. I'm just going to point out a couple of great sites here, one from each of the accent areas if you like. So this is the ABC radio in Australia. There's a whole host of programs. They can listen 24 hours a day, and the streaming online is of a very high quality. Just across the Tasman Sea in New Zealand, .nz, again, very high quality. Obviously, the UK, everyone automatically goes to the BBC. The BBC obviously have a whole host of accents across the British Isles, so it gives students a great exposure, particularly those who are not familiar with the differences in different UK accents. America, obviously, we're spoiled for choice, but npr.org is a great station there for students to listen to. And finally, you might even like to go for the CBC. It's a Canadian Broadcasting Commission, I believe, and they have very good quality programs. Again, all of these sites operate 24 hours a day, and if there's not a live streaming, then podcasts are certainly available for you. All right. Before I go into the individual lessons that I teach, I just to say to you, if you want to go ahead and make your own listening recordings, it's actually not particularly difficult to do. As long as you've written out your transcription, I still do mine in Word document today. And I would just suggest at a starting level, there are two things that you need. One, the piece of hardware is the microphone. which I'm speaking into now. When I first started, the Audio-Technica microphone that you can see on the screen, I think is a really good starting entry level. It's not a perfect microphone, but it will allow you to make sufficiently good recordings to be able to upload them to the internet or use them with any other program on your computer and your students. Secondly, Audacity, audacityteam.org is a fantastic free software to use. It actually looks more complicated than it is, but if you combine the microphone with Audacity and then simply watch a couple of YouTube videos on how to make your recordings as good as possible with Audacity, you'll find it's a very good system. Okay, so back to the lessons and the introduction. As I said, I go through and ensure students understand it's spoken, the recordings are played only once. There are 4 parts. And then in the first lesson, the other thing that students really haven't been tested on for a long time is spelling and numbers. And you will find that students who are extremely proficient in the English language are still unable to hear still unable to hear or use spelling and numbers correctly. Numbers, we all count in our native language. It's very rare for a person who has learned a second or third language to use that language confidently in everyday mathematical transactions. So people will always revert to their native tongue. IELTS will always test spelling and numbers in the first recording or part 1 of the listening exam. So I always make sure that I've got a couple of recordings in there that students are comfortable with dealing with the different types of numbers. And then, of course, with spelling, you still want students to be able to remember, okay, I've given them some challenging things here. Obviously, these words are unlikely to appear in an IELTS exam, but you want them to have the opportunity that they feel very strong, particularly with J, Y, H, those letters that might confound them in their own language. So that's where I go with lesson 1, introduction to the structure, ensure that spelling and numbers are spot on. As we go into lesson 2 with the student, these are the types of questions that will always appear. There will be either a flowchart, students will have to complete some form of notes, tables, summaries, and forms. Now, all of these are just different expressions to record information. And students like us will come across these types of these forms of information every day of our lives, but it's not often that we have to listen to somebody speaking to us about them. And this is the thing about IELTS. I'll say the same thing when we get to plans and maps and diagrams. They are forms of information that we use every single day. We can read these tables, forms, and maps, but when we listen to directions or listen to somebody talking us our way around a map, we need a different set of skills. So here I just want to show you a couple of things that I do is when we get to the maps, flowcharts, etc., one of the most important things to understand in IELTS is that you must read the instruction super carefully. And in listening, this is incredibly challenging, as in the reading exam, because if you do not meet these parameters, you will always be marked incorrect. Sometimes what happens is students will hear something, they've heard the 2 words that they believe that they need, but the answer parameters has asked for only 1 word or no more than 1 word and a number. And so no matter what the student writes, if they write 2 words in that instance, the answer will be marked incorrectly. And that's something that you should teach your student or go over with your student from the very beginning of teaching them any IELTS activity, and come back to that time and time again. If you can create exercises that have very strict parameters, these will come in handy when it comes to sentence completion and short sentence answers as well, which I will go through later on. So with forms, The interesting thing is here is that you don't always have to have a grammatically correct answer. When you are completing, so that here, so you would have, in this case, a table, it's a timetable, and you can see it's for trains. What the first thing you want to do with the student is ask them the context. Allow them to see the information before playing any recording that you've done. And here, for example, I've got recordings. I haven't mentioned before, but this is the website that me and my partners have built. And the recordings are at the top here. So I allow the student to look, first of all, at the question, force them to read the question. You want them to look at 5, 6, 7, and 8 and ask you in context what, oh, sorry, I went too far there. Sorry, just let me come back. I slipped through too far. Okay, and you want the students to answer which kinds of numbers would they expect. So you want them to guess and try and elicit what goes in there before playing the recording. I will also state that in most cases, if we click here, I don't encourage you to show actual audio transcriptions. Because these are listening exercises, I don't believe it helps students to see the transcription, but I do make allowances for this, particularly when I come to prepositions and prepositional phrases that are used in maps. So here, I would ask the student to look at the information, and then when they have provided some or suggested some possible answers, play the recording. I won't play it for you now, but play the recording and then give them the opportunity to answer that one there. Again, what you want to do here with notes, you do not need to be grammatically correct. They are exactly that. They are notes, and they will be clear here in the parameters, no more than 3 words and a number. It's quite a long recording that I've attached to this one. It's 3 minutes and 9 seconds long, and so the students would go through and add these ones. These are possibly the hardest questions as a teacher for you to find good examples of, because it usually involves paraphrasing, and the students have to have that ability to do so as well. I'll just come on next to show you finally. One thing that students will need is a great lexical resource, and I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I tend not to teach vocabulary and grammar with an IELTS candidate. However, it is important that they have some flexibility and elasticity with their language, so I do exercises like this where I change, for example, in number 1, once the problem was identified, okay, and then move that in number 2 after identifying the problem. What I do is give students an opportunity, or here's a presentation where the language is used in a verb or as a gerund or later on as a noun, and you want students to be very aware of that elasticity that's required in the listening part of the exam in particular. Again, this is very relevant for reading. So at the end, a couple of exercises here where you would want them to provide the noun forms of these verbs, or perhaps even get them to put them into sentences into different ways, get them to use a gerund after a preposition, or an ing form after a preposition, these kinds of things. Okay, so once I've moved on from forms and notes, the next one, and this is quite a common one to find in IELTS exam, are short answer questions. So I'll go through. Short answer questions are really interesting. I enjoy teaching them as well, because when you teach short answer questions, you want to also teach distractors. Distractors are something that are used heavily by the IELTS, in the IELTS questions, and what they are is it's information that appears in the recording that is there to almost trick you, certainly to take you off the path and really test your ability to identify correct information. So here again, I emphasize that students must read the questions before listening to the recording, because in IELTS they will give you people will say the wrong thing and then they will come through and correct themselves. So a great exercise for this is to ask students, when we make mistakes ourselves, what kind of language do we use to correct ourselves, and what language do we use to correct or clarify with others? So along with distractors, and I've got quite a long here you will see, for example, as I mentioned before, I don't always use transcriptions, but this is one that I would allow the student, first of all, to think of the answers in context. Secondly, I would play the recording. But third, afterwards, I would probably go through being a long text and allow the student to identify the distractors, because they are commonly used by all native speakers every day. The more excited the argument or the discussion, the more likely that you will actually hear a distractor as you go through. Importantly, along with short answers, is the function of language. And this goes hand in hand with distractors. Sometimes we need to know why people are saying things, and this is vital for a candidate to understand. This obviously will be vital in parts 1 and 3, where you will have a conversation between 2 or 3, I think it can go up to 4, no, between 2 or 3 people, and they will be tossing ideas backwards and forwards, asking for correction, for clarification, perhaps rejecting an answer, and moving to a new topic. So I've got some exercises here and advise you to do the same thing, where students really look at these different functions of the language. Obviously, they are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes words that we use for correction will also be used for verification. Agreement is very different to rejection, but confirmation might also include moving to a new topic. So just keep in mind that you want the student to understand these basic functions. I think is probably enough, but there are obviously some nuances to them as well. So after the short answer questions, the next lesson that I would focus on would be the sentence completion. And these are different to short answer questions, because sentence completion questions must be grammatically accurate. And again, this is where lexical resource and the student's elasticity with the language comes into its own, where they may need to change nouns into verbs. They've got to put in their articles and their prepositions if required, remember their count and non-countable nouns or uncountable nouns. So they come into their own in the sentence completion questions. In particular, I just want to show you here is an introductory exercise that I would give to a student. Again, you can see we've got a phrasal verb, a prepositional verb, the noun, the gerund form, and an adjective, all with agree. And they will only fit correctly in one of these exercises. It's really to get the student thinking about how they need to be very flexible with the language. And even these have different senses, even though they all come from the same word agree. There's obviously a different sense to agree to and agree with something. So you want to make sure that the student's feeling comfortable with that kind of flexibility in the language. I would also say, I'll go to a little bit further down this lesson. The other important thing to start introducing is paraphrasing. It is vital in the reading section, but also you will expect people, you will expect in the IELTS exam that the questions will actually, and the options for those questions, the answers will actually be paraphrasing of what's said. So it's very important that students can understand synonyms, or that they can provide synonyms for the questions. And that's one of the things that I ask them to do in exercises, is when I give them, when they're looking at a question, before listening to the exercise, paraphrase the words in the question options that they might be able to think about that the speaker could say in another way. in the recording itself. It's paraphrasing is used all of the time. Briefly touch on synonyms, although don't make this a focus of any lesson with an IELTS candidate, because if they are sitting the test, English vocabulary is so large, like any language, that it is impossible just to sit there and think that by teaching them extra vocabulary, this is really going to assist them in the IELTS test. It's usually too late. Most of us don't have photographic memories, so I would suggest just get a feeling for how they are, and obviously reading is the best way to increase vocabulary at this point. And I give them opportunities here also to do more and more paraphrasing. Okay, as I move on, I think there was one slide more that I wanted to speak about with paraphrasing. I would introduce here, as IELTS does, there's always at the beginning of the IELTS recording, somebody is going to give a very instruction about you're going to listen to a man or a woman or a speaker who will talk about such and such subject. I asked the students to think about that language, how they could paraphrase it, what kind of words would be appropriate to be heard here, what you may not hear, and then verbs and nouns start getting elastic with the language. And then, again, more of a controlled activity. Here are the questions here, and the sentence completion questions. So without hearing the recording, before hearing the recording, what words could appear in a grammatically correct fashion to complete these gap-filled sentences? Okay, so that's how I would deal with the sentence completion. I'm going to talk finally about plans, maps, and diagrams. These are really interesting because, again, all of us have so much exposure to this kind of information on a daily basis. We read subway, underground, metro plans every day. We're constantly now looking at, using Google Maps. We're constantly searching for information in these forms, and yet listening to it is another thing altogether, I believe. So I'll go through, and what I normally do is introduce a similar plan. This is probably a little more complex than that would appear on an IELTS exam, but get the students to start thinking about all of the language that would be in this. Try to identify what this plan is, where those labels are, and really seek out how good the student's ability is to take you, for example, from the porch. They might be on a tour with you, and they might take you and see if you can get them to direct you using language to A, B, and C, given the language and the information that is already shown on the map. So it's a really good way of starting to check the understanding and use of prepositions of place, prepositions of movement, and other prepositional phrases. I've mentioned once before, I don't focus on grammar and vocabulary when teaching IELTS. However, with maps, plans, and diagrams, it is really important that students have a very good understanding of prepositions of place and movement. So do feel free to go back. I've got a ton of lessons on the site that deal with these, but make sure that your student does feel comfortable, because there are simply many, many of them in the English language. Once I've done the plans here, let me move to the next screen here. Again, prepositions of place and movement. I go over all of these with the students and possibly offer a few more. And then I start introducing the maps. Now, obviously, I'm happy for you to come onto our site and use ours, but feel free to do something that's very basic, that's on paper, that you can keep and use again and again. You can start with something like this that has labels all over it and ask the student, okay, to guide you through. If you're using a map online, or you feel like you've got an eraser handy, of course, you can actually draw, on the map and get them to take you to different places. Sorry, 3, 2 cups should come next. But anyway, you can get them to take you to different places. That really starts to test the language, and for them to think about the language that they are actually going to hear. So if you've got the ability to draw on the screen, I highly recommend it. And then as you move from labeled maps, you can start asking the student, okay, You decide what's in each of these rooms and you guide me through them. And that really starts to get them to use the language that becomes very close to what they are going to hear in the IELTS recordings. Okay, and then eventually I actually start doing quite difficult tasks once we get to this point, because they've done sentence completion, they've done forms, they've done tables, notes, summaries, short answers by the time I get to plans, maps and diagrams. So I start introducing a lot of distractors and paraphrasing with these final three. Again, making sure the prepositions, I've got some nice, you can find a lot of stuff on the net, but we've got some nice diagrams here for practicing those prepositions of place. And then finally, I'll have something that is extremely challenging, even for the English teachers, but it really allows students to listen for specific information. And in fact, this one is a plan of a Roman villa. All of the terms that they must find are in Latin. So what the students do is, because they have read this before listening, they already know what they're listening to, and they can concentrate heavily on the words that are used to guide them through the Roman villa. And this is exactly what you want. Even if we're using foreign words, the students are still able to get a real sense of achievement by listening for the prepositions of movement and place. Okay, so that's with maps. It's a similar thing as we move on to, sorry, that was plans, onto maps and diagrams. But obviously, with maps, you are going to hear many more prepositions of movement. When I introduce maps, and you might like to do the same thing, is so that you can reuse the language again and again, you want to have places that are familiar. And obviously on maps, we tend to see a lot of icons. These are becoming more and more standardized around the world. So I always introduce icons. The students can discuss what they may have, or what they would represent on a map in their own country, or what they have experience with. And then it's very easy to start doing testing the language as you go along. Here again, we have some very standardized language that we use with, for example, a road map. And these appear quite frequently in the IELTS listening exams. So here, I would start checking with the student their comfort level, starting with me at the museum, for example, and then perhaps taking me, I'll draw a quick line. I don't know why I have to go from the museum to the hospital, but in this case, you can ask them to start guiding you around. Perhaps I'll go for a copy one, after that. You want them to start using all of that language. This is, again, very easy if you're in an online situation, or if you haven't, draw your own maps or come on and have a look at ours. You might be happy to use something like this. Go through the language about following directions. We either use the imperative. We can also use the second person singular form. When you've done this, do this afterwards, you will find here. And of course, modal verbs are quite common. The politer people are, the more they're going to throw can and could, not very specific directions, but you're going to hear it. Okay, and then I will just go very briefly, a more challenging map. Ask the student to take you around. Okay, you can decide where your starting point is, and the student can give you the prepositions of movement, a very good opportunity. And then once you've done that, I'll go through prepositions of movement just to ensure that the student's super comfortable with those. And finally, I start doing quite challenging exercises. So bring all of that language together. Here, you've got choosing options from a list. You'll notice that IELTS does this quite often, where there are more options than there are answers to be given. So always get the students to go through that language first. What do they think these places could be? Because although you've got art gallery, which is obvious what that would be, one of these places is called Guild Hall. It's unlikely that somebody would know that. And another just called Longreach. So looking at the map, what places do they think they might represent? And finally, I'll come to far more complex things where this is exactly the type of thing that you would see in IELTS. perhaps a few more choices in this one, but you will see a map with A to F, not in any particular order, and then of course they have the question options here. They're going to probably start obviously here, and the speaker will guide them around. So that's how I deal with maps. And finally, perhaps the most challenging, not just for students, but also for teachers, are diagrams. These are going to be the questions where there is a diagram and the students need to place labels on it, and it often shows parts of the machine or parts of a process. And it is unlikely, even as a native speaker, that you are familiar with all of the language. However, obviously IELTS provides it all for you, and again, you're listening for specific information. You might like to run over very quickly diagrams. This again, this one's in the form of a flowchart on the right, okay, for cheese making process. And again, without focusing on the language, you do want the student to understand the basics of machine parts. And it's not too hard, so you can get them to try and think about these basic words. You might want to extend it a little bit further, but just the basics of mechanics can be very, very helpful, and describing where they are and also what they do. When someone describes in an IELTS recording a process, you are always going to find the language of transition words and linking words. And so when I do not necessarily maps or plans, but certainly with diagram lessons, I will always get them to listen to this vast array of words that we have in English: first, second, next, afterwards. There's a whole barrel that you can go through, and I actually put them here, for example, in the flashlight one. This recording you will see is 3.5 minutes long. Lots of language next to this, after reaching this point, etc. So I would go through, let me just see, here we go. So lots of great linking words that you will use when teaching diagrams in particular, and when students are listening to a process. Here there was the cheese making process, I believe. They're going to hear a lot of these words come through. Okay, I think that's, oh sorry, no, that's not, there's one last lesson that I would teach for a student, and that's going through multiple choice and matching questions. Now, most students from the very beginning of their ESL career, if you like, have always encountered multiple choice questions. They're very familiar to the student. However, IELTS does use them in a very different way, or in a very challenging way, because what IELTS does is, as you go through the recording, IELTS is very clever. The recording will often repeat all of these at some point in the recording, and it is the candidate's job to work out what is corrected and what is incorrect, so that they can really reach they will select the correct answer. So when you're doing multiple choice exercises with an IELTS candidate, be very aware that in the recording, the trick is to place this first, and then the student simply stops listening and goes to the next question in the exam. This is the wrong thing to do, because 2 seconds later, the speaker will correct him or herself and say, oh, that date was wrong, it's not June the 13th, it's June the 14th. You will often hear all of the options. So language to watch out for in multiple choice with the speakers are things like but, however, though, words expressing contrast. Right. And finally, one of the things that you will need to do is identify language that expresses the speaker's attitude or opinion. And this will be the last thing I talk about. Okay, so in okay, so here you will often hear adjectives, okay, that are used. The speaker may say it themselves, or with the student, you should think about, if you are unsure about something, what are words that we use to express that you are unsure or that you're disappointed. You want them to really be able to identify how the speaker feels. And this is quite part 3 of the test, where you will have a conversation between 2 or 3 students. This is very valid for this area of the test in general. And finally, the final question type that you will come to is matching questions. Here you will have 2 sets of information, and I'll just take you to one so it's easier, it's visualized. You will have in a box probably more options than are required, and then here the student obviously needs to write the letters A and F as they go through. Again, all options are probably repeated or heard in the recording, so students need to get very used to listening very carefully, and what they can do is, as they hear the option, the strategy is cross it out because it won't be used again unless specified in the instruction. You won't hear it again, and that's a great way of starting to reduce what they're actually listening for as you go along. So they are essentially the 8 introductory lessons. I would do a final one before the exam that really goes over everything to make sure the student's very comfortable with the structure, that they would actually be able to tell me what they're going to hear, and that they are really ready for it. But that is the structure that I would use. So this is the structure that I would use to teach them, making sure that you cover all the question types. And students, when you give them, once you've done these kinds of lessons, what you want to be doing leading up to the exam is making sure that when you give a student an exercise, the first thing they're doing is telling you what type of what question type this is, and what information can possibly be used as an answer. Okay, so I'm going to finish there. Chris, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to pass over to you, and perhaps you can either guide me with questions or take it over from here.
Okay, thank you, James.